Hi, I wanted to use this opportunity to share with you 5 paranormal investigation role playing games that are quite flexible in theme and maybe they are unknown to some gamers out there, to some players. So I hope you will find something that you will enjoy in this list of 5 games. I also want to respond or answer to a comment made by Hujands. Hi Hujands, he basically said that if I could speak about immersion in solo horror role-playing games. And before we get started with all of that, I also want to remind all of you, or maybe some of you do not know, that every October, Drivethrurpg has a sort of Halloween hunt event. They basically hide pumpkins and ghosts and bats all over their store and their other pages like the Drive-Thru Comics and the Dungeons and Dragons page. I forgot the name. I'm going to put the links in the description below, and I'm also going to put the potential locations of those pumpkins, ghosts, etc. Because sometimes they change the locations, sometimes they do not appear in certain pages, but most of the time I think you will find at the very least 5 free items depending on the place where you are looking for. Sometimes it's a bit difficult to understand how that hunt works. Sometimes, for example, you go to Drivethrurpg and you click on the pumpkin or the witch hat, etc., and they give you a free role-playing game. Because those, sorry, excuse me, if you do not know, you basically get free stuff by clicking on those Halloween icons. But like I said, they are spread out through the different pages, Drivethrurpg, Drive-Thru Comics, Drive-Thru Fiction as well, I think. So I'm going to put the locations in the description of this video. And if you find something else that is not in the list of this description, please let us know in the comment section, because sometimes they do switch places. Sometimes you thought that it was in the newsletter section and it's not there, it's in the your account section and such. Well, let's get started with the list. First, I'm going to start with Ghost Stories Expanded. Ghost Stories is one of those RPG systems that can take on any sort of story that you want to play with that role-playing game. It's not geared towards a particular theme. It's basically just that role-playing game where you play as investigators taking on mysteries and threats of a ghostly nature. There could also be evil beings of the Fae, all sorts of undead. So it depends on what you want to have in your sessions. The characters that you create there lean more towards a more realistic approach. You do not have classes. It's you basically build your character from scratch. You do have occult and paranormal powers if the game master decides to allow that. But I think the greatest strength of Ghost Stories is that you can basically play almost anything. Now, when I talk about paranormal investigations, that is in modern times, or a bit before that, let's say recent times. This is not focused on the Victorian era or medieval horror investigations and such. This is more modern times. In fact, in this list, I'm not going to mention Call of Cthulhu because everyone knows about Call of Cthulhu. And I think it would be a good idea if perhaps in a few days I would make a list of Cthulhu related games that you may not know about. Could be a good idea. But in this case, I'm focusing on more like generic or flexible themes. And Ghost Stories, like I said, you can play any sort of story, modern or of recent times. The characters are a bit more realistic, but you still have that potential of using some paranormal, supernatural stuff. The expanded rulebook also comes with a lot of scenarios, and you even have a free scenario in the Presses Intermedia page of Drivethrurpg. So I recommend that you get Ghost Stories if you are not exactly sure if you want to play a specific theme or a specific style of horror, Ghost Stories can pretty much handle everything. And the core system is also quite easy to understand. You basically roll two six-sided dice. You need to roll below a number. This number is the sum of a skill plus an attribute that is related to the task at hand. So for example, maybe you have an attribute of 3 and a skill of 4, that you would need to roll 7 or below that. And the difficulty of such a roll is going to be modified depending on the circumstances, on the tools that you are using, etc. So Ghost Stories Expanded, it's a really solid choice if you want to play a paranormal or supernatural investigation sort of role-playing game. Next we have Silent Legions. I think many of you already know about this game. It's from Kevin Crawford, one of the, I would consider him one of the masters of the old school Renaissance. This feels quite a bit like, it's basically old school Dungeons and Dragons, but in modern times with paranormal investigation elements. At times it feels a lot like Call of Cthulhu meets Dungeons and Dragons, but it's not necessary to play it like that. You have a complete system to create all sorts of creatures and monsters and mysteries. They don't have to be completely mythos focused. The player characters feel like the Dungeons and Dragons classes. You have a character that is good at fighting. You have another one that is a detective sort of character. You have a socialite. So if you like old school Dungeons and Dragons, I think you will love Silent Legions. And Silent Legions has one of the best, probably the best perhaps, sandbox toolkit to create campaigns that are in the sandbox style, of course. The system of tags and all of the elements that you can use to build adventures and campaigns, they are just perfect for the sandbox experience. It's so good that even if you play other role-playing games based on horror or paranormal or supernatural investigations, I think you will use this system of tags for sandbox campaigns in those games as well. So it's really a good idea to get Silent Legions. And because Silent Legions is compatible with pretty much any other old school Renaissance sort of role-playing game, and of course other entries by Kevin Crawford, other games, you can customize this experience further. Because for example, maybe you own Other Dust, another game by Kevin Crawford. It's a post-apocalyptic role-playing game, and you want a horror investigation in post-apocalypse times. You could combine it with Other Dust. Or if you want something in the far future, quite sci-fi, you could combine Silent Legions with Stars Without Number. So definitely get this one if you like that sandbox sort of experience that has many elements that will remind you of Dungeons and Dragons. So yeah, it's a really good, really solid choice. Now, I also want to talk about Dark Streets, Darker Secrets. This horror role-playing game also feels a bit like Dungeons and Dragons. The system is quite similar. Most of the time you're going to be rolling a d20 below a certain number. But I think that the strongest point of Dark Streets is that you also have a toolkit to create adventures, although it's more focused, in my opinion, on story arcs and site-based adventures and campaigns rather than an entire sandbox. You could create a sandbox with it, but I think it works a bit more smoothly when it comes to story arcs and site-based affairs. So when it comes to Dark Streets, the characters, I would say that they are a bit more capable or powerful when you compare them with the character classes on Silent Legions. You have archetypes that feel like character classes, but some of them are really powerful overall. Like for example, you have the Tough, if I'm not mistaken, the Tough archetype, and with that character you can pretty much slug it out or go toe to toe against many horrors. If you wanted to play as Ash from Evil Dead, that's a perfect class to dark archetypes to choose. You also have one that is called the Gifted. You basically have like supernatural blood running through your veins. So you have some useful, albeit sometimes situational powers. Some, for example, a vampiric power that allows you to regenerate yourself by drinking blood. Maybe you have the blood of aliens coursing through your veins, and you have a sort of psionic telepathy, some sort of telepathy. Mm, or maybe you have Atlantean blood, and you do not age as fast as normal humans, and you are very resistant to disease, etc. So some really interesting character archetypes there. If you want characters that are a bit more powerful, I would get this one instead of Silent Legions, but if you want a grittier experience, I would go with Silent Legions. Now you also have a Crypt World. Crypt World uses the old school pace setter system. For those that do not know, it's basically a very simple table. So you make your roll, you use 10-sided dice to do this roll, and depending on your result, you're going to get different effects. For example, maybe you are fighting against some sort of enemy, and maybe you wound that enemy with light wounds, or maybe some heavier or more severe wounds, or maybe the enemy is crushed and you knock it back, or the enemy falls prone. So if you like to look at a simple table to see what results you obtained, Crypt World is really good for that. Something that I forgot to mention before we move further, is the capacity of playing Dark Streets as a solo or co-op experience. If you purchase the, I think it's called Darkstalker module, I'm going to put the link in the description below. It's basically a Game Master emulator. It uses the elements present in the core rulebook of Dark Streets. So I am also going to link a video that gives you a really good overview. I think it covers the entire supplement actually. So you can decide if you want to play Dark Streets as a sort of solo or co-op experience. But going back to Crypt World, like I said, it's a really fun game if you like to use tables. I think that the style and the art it's more suitable for some adventures and campaigns in the style of 80s novels and 80s movies. So you want to play like adventures where they do not have cell phones, and when internet does not exist or is just in its infancy, depending on the place where you are setting the adventure, Crypt World is a really good choice for that. It's also a very complete game that is can handle pretty much any sort of theme. And when you compare it to other role-playing games mentioned in this list, like Dark Streets, that has a sort of more punkish, dystopian, or anarchist sort of style to it, I forgot to mention that. Crypt World feels a lot more retro, more old school, a bit more classic. Now when it comes to a crunchier recommendation, I would definitely suggest the Creepypasta role-playing game. This role-playing game is probably the crunchiest game of this list. You basically have a dice pool. It's composed of D8, D10, and D12 dice, if I remember correctly, depending on your attributes, and you make your roll with all of those dice, and you take the highest two results. And the results can get quite swingy, as you would expect from a creepypasta situation. Sometimes you accomplish something quite extraordinarily, but other times you fail completely. You also have exploding dice to added to this. So yeah, you really get some swingy results. Now when it comes to the theme of creepypasta, there are already a lot of people that are familiar with the term, but it's basically those internet stories that are supposedly true, but you know that they are not. They are fiction because of sometimes it's quite open knowledge that they resulted from different events or trends. Like for example, a lot of you know about Slenderman. He was the result of a sort of art contest, right? So you have all of those things like Jeff the Killer or Ben Drowned when it comes to a cursed video game. So all of those curses, rituals, entities cryptids, all of those things that you see running around as rumors and short stories in the internet. This is the game to play that. They give you a really good chapter telling you how to customize the experience for a particular type of story. They divide it by categories, that if you want to play a story featuring cryptids, you need to use these elements. If you want it to feature this sort of ritual, use these other elements. So it's a really good way of playing that sort of creepypasta experience. I also like it that they have this sanity feature where your character is either too naive or a bit insane. And I think this fits many creepypasta stories because characters are either too naive or they are losing their minds. And this is represented in the game with a naive character having an easier time regaining sanity, because if you take too much damage to your sanity, you end up completely insane. But because your character is so naive, when it comes to a combat encounter, you lose the first round, the first initiative round. So that means that the enemy is going to get a free strike again against you right away. It could even result in your death. But if you're more insane, because you are so paranoid and always on edge, you actually get to strike. You have a chance of striking first in combat, but it's harder for you to regain sanity points, so it's a downward spiral until your character goes completely insane. So I would recommend that role-playing game if you want a crunchier experience when it comes to paranormal investigations. And all of the links are going to be in the description below, so you can check them out. So just to sum things up, Ghost Stories Expanded can handle pretty much anything, and the system is very easy to use. And you can also customize the experience if you want to include paranormal or psychic powers or occult powers and such for the player characters. When it comes to Silent Legends, it's a perfect sandbox toolkit with a Dungeons and Dragons feel to the entire experience, but in modern times. Dark Streets, Darker Secrets, you already have that very attractive feature of playing it as a co-op or solo experience with the Darkstalker solo module. It's also a great toolkit to create story arcs when it comes to horror investigation, non-player characters as well. The player characters themselves are a bit more powerful when compared to other characters in other horror investigation role-playing games. Crypt World has that solid 80s feel to it. When compared, like I said, with Dark Streets is a bit more punkish, more on the dystopian side. Crypt World, it's basically the classic horror story, but you need to have a certain love or perhaps nostalgia for using that pace setter table to determine the results. But I think it's a good comparison that if you put it alongside Ghost Stories, these two games could be considered like the most flexible of the bunch. So if you love tables, go for Crypt World. If you want a simpler system, go for Ghost Stories. And Creepypasta, if you want a crunchier experience, because in Creepypasta you can actually, for example, shoot from the hip or pointing your gun, or just shooting almost in an improvisation way, almost without aiming, just really fast. It's all going to influence the way that you attack or the way that the attack potentially hits the enemy. So yes, I hope you will find one of those role-playing games to your liking. Now let's move to the next part of this video, which is Hujands' comment about immersion in solo horror role-playing games. Well, I'm going to support myself a bit on what I have already answered in my questions and answers video. I'm going to put a link in the description below to that video if you haven't seen it. I'm also going to put the mark where I talk about this, answering Hujands' question. So, like I said in that video, you need three main things in my opinion, but I'm going to expand upon those things towards the horror role-playing direction in this video. Well, you need a horror system that you are comfortable with, a horror role-playing game system, because it's going to pull you out of that horror experience, if you are constantly looking for that rule or that stat or that mechanic, you need to have a really good grasp on the system. And this doesn't mean that you need to use a very easy or simple system. If you have a really good handle or understanding of a complex role-playing game system, you can also use that system, of course. So the objective is that you do not spend like more than a couple of minutes looking for a rule, because when you start to look at all of those mechanics, those numbers, those words, they could end up pulling you from the scenario. The fiction is going to your link with that fiction is going to weaken, and you will no longer believe in that story that you are playing. So you definitely need a good system that you have a really good grasp on it. Now, when it comes to consistency or coherency, like I said in that other video, depending on the emulator that you are using, the tables and the results, of course, you need to pull everything together towards that horror theme. If you're suddenly coming up with a lot of comedic or romantic results, you need to steer those things or those elements towards the horror theme. It's just that sometimes you can really go off rails when it comes to the storyline and theme. It's possible to integrate comedy, of course. It's just, you could consider it a sort of tension relief moment or comedy relief. But as many of you know, in movies and books, when those moments happen, they are usually there so that the reader or the audience, they lower their guard, and then a jump scare or a more subtle horrifying theme or element or story element rather is revealed, and you feel scared because you were already too perhaps relaxed because of the comedic element. And when it comes to romance, I think it's even easier to integrate romance if you get those random results in a table when it comes to a horror experience, because many horror stories, for example like gothic horror, they include elements of romance. So the addition of some romantic elements could introduce some drama, tragedy, and despair to the story. So it's all about being flexible and taking some unexpected results that you got from an emulator or a table and steer them towards the true horror of the story. You can also be really careful about the emulators and the tables that you are choosing for a horror role-playing game. Some systems actually have like a horror section. The more specific the results or the way that you narrow things towards horror, it's going to be even easier to improvise or modify any results that seem to move too off rails when it comes to the experience, the horror experience that you were looking for. Now, when it comes to the reinforcement of the fictional reality, I think this becomes a bit more complex when it comes to horror immersion in solo RPGs. Well, like I said before, you could use different tools, props, and perhaps even costumes to reinforce this. If you like miniatures, just get some really gruesome looking miniatures. If you have your favorite miniatures that you have painted and they look quite horrifying, zombies or vampires, whatever, you can use those miniatures and they are going to pull you into the experience. You need something that stimulates your imagination. When it comes to tiles, get the more detailed and gruesome looking tiles. Don't use like those generic tiles from Castle Ravenloft, the board game. Those tiles they only have like coffins sometimes. Maybe you could use the coffin tiles, but if you are constantly using those gray slabs, maybe it will pull you out of the experience. There are some really good horror tiles out there. I'm going to put a link to some of them in the description to my review of a set of those tiles, because I think that the more realistic tiles will help to pull you into the experience. Now, when it comes to other things, like I told you, in that other questions and answers video where I talked about this player that usually he used something on his head, like a hat or some sort of headpiece that constantly reminds him of the experience that he is playing. That is, if he's playing Wild West, he would put him a hat, like a cowboy hat on. And like I told you, if he wanted to play a medieval sort of game, medieval fantasy, and I recommended this like cardboard hat from Fat Dragon Games that you can print it and you put it on thick card or cardboard. If you feel that you are pulled into the experience by wearing something, well, go ahead. Maybe you are playing like a horror game with pirates. Maybe you want to to use your tricorn hat or an eye patch, or like I said, maybe it's a weird west or horror west sort of experience. Maybe you want your cowboy hat or your sombrero. If you are playing a noir sort of role-playing game, maybe you want your Dick Tracy sort of hat or a fedora or something. So yes, that's a way to reinforce that. Now, when it comes to music, I think this becomes a bit more complex. Like I said, you really need a soundtrack that perfectly matches the experience. So for example, if you're going to be playing Cult Divinity Lost, use the Cult Divinity Lost soundtrack. I already reviewed that soundtrack. I'm going to put the link in the description below. It has some really cool songs, but some of them, most of them, feel a lot more geared towards the cult experience with demons, Jewish mythology. Some of them feel quite modern, so I wouldn't use most of those tracks with, for example, a 1920s sort of experience, unless perhaps if it features a lot of like demons and fallen angels, maybe. But the moment that you feel like the music is not fitting the theme or the flavor of the adventurer campaign, you will be pulled out of the horror experience. So definitely choose the right soundtrack. If, for example, maybe you are using Savage Worlds to play a Silent Hill sort of game, use the music from Silent Hill. If you are using All Flesh Must Be Eaten, use the soundtrack for Resident Evil, for example. It depends if you want to play like like zombies and conspiracies and governments and labs and all of that. Use the Resident Evil soundtrack. I forgot to mention this about Crypt World. With Crypt World, because of the pace setter system, you could also use Rot World, for example, if you want to reinforce the zombie theme, or I think it was called Magus. There's a game called Magus, if I'm not mistaken. If you want to add more magic to your experience on that sense, Crypt World is also quite flexible when it comes to customizing it with existing role-playing games. Well, going back to the thing about music, yes, you need a specific soundtrack for the experience that you are looking for. But if you simply do not find a soundtrack that fits your particular role-playing game, you could also use ambient sounds. There are many videos here on YouTube with sounds of like a creepy forest and mansions and stormy seas, and there are also like sounds of a train with thunderstorms. So it depends on where the adventure is taking place. If you are playing a sort of horror module that inside of a train or a ship, yes, do have it would be good. It would be a good idea to use the sound of rain and wind and thunder, perhaps something howling in the distance. I'm going to put a couple of recommendations in the description of this video. Yes, I think it's really easy to find ambient sounds, but just in case, I'm going to put a couple of recommendations. Now, when it comes to other things that could reinforce the immersion in solo horror role-playing games, those would be images. Just take a look at what I have behind me. I have all those books of horror role-playing games and fiction and a board game in the case of Carnival Zombie. So if you play your game while looking at those images, they are going to be there to remind you of the experience that you are playing. Like, for example, many of you know that I'm running a solo campaign featuring From the Ashes. I always listen to Dark Souls, Demon Souls sort of music and soundtrack from here on YouTube. So usually those videos have these images from the game, from the cover, the concept art. So I just need to look at those, and it really helps. It serves as a sort of support or tool or aid for me to better envision or imagine what is going on in the From the Ashes campaign. I would also recommend that you watch movies, read comic books, play video games that follow the same style that you are playing. So if you are playing a solo role-playing game, like I said, for example, in my case, From the Ashes, and if I wanted to reinforce the immersion, I would play Dark Souls, Demon Souls, etc. So it all depends on the game that you are playing. Try to watch those movies if you are, for example, using All Flesh Must Be Eaten, but you want a more demonic type of zombie rather than the product of some sort of biohazard or virus or bacteria. Maybe you could watch Night of the Demons or Evil Dead. So there are many ways in which you can enhance or strengthen the immersion. Hujands, I hope these tips or advice, I hope you will find them useful in your solo RPG sessions, and all of you as well, of course. I hope everyone gets some use of what I shared this night, and I also hope that you will find one of these 5 horror or paranormal investigation role-playing games to your liking. And remember, these Drivethrurpg Halloween hunt usually begins around October 16, so maybe tomorrow, or maybe it's going to start next week. You just have to keep your eyes open and check out the description in this video to see the different places where you can find the pumpkins and the cats and ghosts and witch hats, etc. So you can get some free games. You usually get free games, some fiction, comic books, you never know. It's going to be really fun in my opinion. Well, thanks for watching this video. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. And thank you so much to those of you that have been sending Drivethrurpg gift certificates. If anyone else wants to further support the channel, the information how to do that will be in the description below. Once again, thank you, and see you later.